Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss the MOOCs module of criminal law on wrongful restraint, confinement, assault and criminal force. Before we begin, I'm sure you've gone through the other modules of MOOCs for various other topics and you've benefited a lot from that. Now, today we'll be dealing with the concept of wrongful restraint, confinement, assault and criminal force, which are important concepts in criminal law. Let's take a look at what each of these offences mean in the Indian Penal Code. Section 339 of the IPC covers wrongful restraint, whereas Section 340 deals with wrongful confinement. Wrongful restraint and wrongful confinement, while differ from each other on various points, they are also linked with each other on points of similarity. Before we begin a discussion on the points of differences and similarities between them, it would be apt to understand the concept of wrongful restraint first, as it is intricately linked with the concept of wrongful confinement. It is important to understand that wrongful confinement as a concept had its presence in the law of torts as false imprisonment. So, what exactly is wrongful restraint and how is it linked with the concept of wrongful confinement? It is important that in wrongful restraint, the idea of restraint is understood. So, for every form of wrongful restraint, it is necessary to have some form of obstruction. Chapter 16 of the Indian Penal Code provides various offences affecting the human body. Now, Section 339 of Chapter 16 defines wrongful restraint. Wrongful restraint as an offence is punishable under Section 341 of the IPC. Whoever voluntarily obstructs any person so as to prevent that person from proceeding in any direction in which that person has a right to proceed is said to wrongfully restrain that person. This is the definition of wrongful restraint provided in Section 339. Exception to Section 339 provides that it is not wrongful restraint to obstruct a private way to a land or water which a person in good faith believes himself to have a lawful right to obstruct. So, what is the scope and object of wrongful restraint as provided under Section 339 and its exception? The main object or the primary object of this section is to protect the freedom of movement of an individual. Any form of unlawful obstruction can be said to be the domain of wrongful restraint. Obstruction, however, need not be physical. It can be by words, by gestures. The idea is, can we convey the meaning, can we convey the intention and the purpose of these words in the sense that can the victim be made to feel that he or she will be facing consequences for traveling in a certain direction, for moving in a certain direction. So, it can be made to appear that the person who has been asked to be wrongfully restrained believes that he cannot proceed in that direction or in a certain manner. So, for Section 339 to operate, an obstruction is extremely necessary. An obstruction should be voluntary in nature. The element of volition is a very important constituent of Section 339. It means that the obstruction which is posed by the accused should be done voluntarily with his knowledge and with the intention that the victim is prevented from proceeding in a direction which he lawfully had the right to proceed in. The obstruction must be such as to prevent that person from proceeding in any direction in which he has a right to proceed. So, in the original draft code of the Indian Penal Code, certain illustrations have been laid down. Let us take a look at some important illustrations to try and understand what wrongful restraint would mean in a given context. Let's say A threatens to set a savage dog at Z. If Z goes along a path along which Z has a natural right to go or proceed in, Z is prevented from going along that path just because A has threatened to set a savage dog at Z. A here wrongfully restrains Z. In the same illustration, if the dog is not really savage, but if A voluntarily causes Z to think that it is savage, then and thereby prevents Z from going in the direction in which he has a right to proceed, even here the offense of wrongful restraint has been committed by A. Likewise, A builds a wall across a path along which Z has a right to pass. Z is prevented from passing because of the wall so built. Here, A is guilty of wrongfully restraining Z. Similarly, if A illegally omits to take proper order with a furious buffalo which is in his possession and thus voluntarily deters Z from passing along a road along which Z has a right to pass, even here A can be said to be wrongfully restraining Z. Another example with which you can probably connect and which will be easier for us to understand can be given in this context. Let us say A is a landlord and B is the tenant. Now, if A, in the absence of B, puts a lock on the door so that when B comes back, he doesn't have a right to enter into the house which he is lawfully entitled to enter, here A can be said to be wrongfully restraining B. So, in other words, wrongful restraint as a concept in itself denies an individual a right to access into such land, such territory, property, or into such direction where he originally and naturally had a right to move. It is a denial of an action to move in a certain direction. The essential elements of this section therefore would be a right to proceed in any direction, and this right must be existing in the victim. Likewise, there must be a voluntary obstruction. The obstruction, in other words, must have been to deter the victim from passing in a certain direction, and it must be based on the volition, on the voluntariness rather, of the accused. Now, for what reason the person has been obstructed is relevant only to the context as to whether there is a reasonable justification for stopping the person to proceed in a direction which he would have ordinarily passed. So, for example, let's say a construction is taking place on a certain road. A mason who was supposed to allow people to pass through that road has been now instructed to not allow people to use that road as it is under construction. So here, if A wants to pass by that road and the mason stops him, the mason is justified in stopping the person from going through the road which is under construction. So here, the passerby or the person who wants to cross the road will not be said to have been victimized by the offense of wrongful restraint. In other words, here the mason cannot be said to have committed the offense of wrongful restraint. Now, there should not be any good faith belief that the accused had a legal right. In other words, if the accused believed that he had a legal right to stop the person from moving in a certain direction and he believed so in good faith, then this would act as an exception to the offense of wrongful restraint, and the offense of wrongful restraint in this case would not be committed. There are various cases where a person has a right to obstruct, and reason behind the obstruction is not relevant. It is relevant only in cases where the obstruction is justified. The form and nature of obstruction is also not relevant. As we have discussed, even if a person is made to believe that he doesn't have a right to pass through a certain area, but he actually does possess the right, and by on the basis of such belief he has been stopped or restrained from proceeding in that direction, you can say that the offense of wrongful restraint has been committed. What is relevant in this case is the result or consequence of the action, and there must be one uniform consequence in this case: denial of movement in a certain direction in which the victim had a right to move. Here, personal liberty is curtailed, and so strict interpretation of the law is necessary.